So people want to act like I'm heartless for choosing my son over some man who couldn't handle a little family drama. But let me tell you what really happened, because everyone's got opinions without knowing the full story. My name's Bethany, I'm 52, and yeah, I got divorced because my husband couldn't accept that my 30-year-old son needed help. But before you start judging me, hear me out. I met Vincent when I was 49. Good-looking guy, retired from law enforcement, had his shit together financially. We clicked right away. He was the stable, protective type, and honestly, after years of dealing with my deadbeat ex-husband, Vincent felt like a breath of fresh air. He had this nice house in the suburbs, drove a decent truck, and seemed genuinely interested in building something real with me. Now, I was upfront about Landon from the beginning. My son was 27 when Vincent and I started dating, and, yeah, he was still living with his dad and struggling to find his footing. I told Vincent that Landon had some challenges: anxiety, depression, trouble holding down jobs. Vincent seemed understanding about it. He'd nod and say stuff like, "Young men these days have it tough, and he just needs the right guidance." I thought he got it, you know? When Vincent proposed after dating for about a year, I specifically asked him if me and Landon were a package deal. I needed to know where he stood, because Landon had been having more difficulties. His dad was getting fed up with him, and I could see the writing on the wall. Vincent looked me right in the eye and said, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But family is family." That felt like a yes to me. That felt like he was saying he'd be there for both of us if needed. We had a small wedding, nothing fancy, just immediate family and a few close friends. Vincent's ex-wife, Carmen, was there with their mutual friends, and I remember her giving me this weird look when I introduced Landon. Like she was trying to warn me about something, but she never said anything directly. Landon was actually on his best behavior that day. He wore a nice suit, helped with setup, gave a sweet speech about how happy he was that I'd found someone who made me smile again. Vincent seemed charmed by him. The first year of marriage was, honestly, pretty great. Vincent and I fell into this comfortable routine. He'd handle the yard work and home repairs. I'd manage most of the cooking and inside stuff. We'd watch our shows together in the evenings, take weekend trips to visit his buddies from work. Landon would come over for Sunday dinners sometimes, and Vincent would ask him about job interviews and dating. It felt like we were building something solid. But I started noticing little things, like when Landon would call me upset about something. Maybe he'd had a panic attack at work, or his dad had been harsh with him. Vincent would get this look on his face, not concerned, but annoyed. Like my son's problems were an inconvenience to him. He'd make these subtle comments afterward, like, maybe he needs to toughen up a bit, or, some people just need to learn the hard way. Easy for him to say. He never had kids of his own, so he didn't understand that bond between a mother and her child. The breaking point came about 2 years into our marriage. Landon got arrested for shoplifting, something stupid. He was broke and hungry and made a terrible decision. His dad completely lost it, told Landon he was done enabling him, and kicked him out immediately. Landon called me sobbing, saying he had nowhere to go and was sleeping in his car. What was I supposed to do? Let my son be homeless? I told Vincent what happened and asked if Landon could stay in our spare room temporarily, just until he got back on his feet. Vincent's whole demeanor changed. He got quiet for a long time, then said, "How temporary are we talking?" I said probably a few months, maybe 6 at most, just long enough for Landon to find work and save up for his own place. Vincent nodded, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. Looking back, I should have pushed harder for Vincent to be honest about his concerns. But I was so focused on helping Landon that I didn't want to deal with Vincent's resistance. I figured once Landon was stable and contributing to the household, Vincent would see that my son just needed a chance. Vincent helped Landon move his stuff in, but it was clear he was doing it for me, not because he wanted to. He was polite but distant, like Landon was a house guest he was tolerating rather than his stepson who was family now. That hurt. But I told myself Vincent would warm up once he got to know Landon better. The first few weeks weren't too bad. Landon was trying. He'd help with dishes sometimes, kept his room relatively clean, was applying for jobs online. But he was also dealing with a lot of shame and anxiety from the arrest and his dad rejecting him. Some days he'd barely come out of his room, and other days he'd have these emotional breakdowns where he'd talk about feeling worthless and unwanted. Vincent had zero patience for any of it. He'd see Landon having a rough day and make comments to me later about wallowing and playing the victim. When I tried to explain that Landon was dealing with real mental health issues, Vincent would roll his eyes and say something about how people his age didn't have these problems because they didn't have time to sit around feeling sorry for themselves. The tension in the house became unbearable. Vincent started spending more time in his workshop or taking long walks to avoid being around us. When he was home, he'd make these passive-aggressive comments about the grocery bill being higher or how someone left dishes in the sink. Everything was always directed at Landon, but delivered to me like I was personally responsible for my son's every action. I found myself constantly mediating between them, trying to keep the peace. I'd ask Landon to be more mindful about cleaning up after himself, and I'd ask Vincent to be more patient and understanding. But nothing I did seemed to help. Vincent was determined to see Landon as a lazy mooch, and Landon could sense the hostility and started getting defensive and resentful. About 6 months in, things took a turn for the worse. Landon started having what I can only describe as episodes. He'd talk about hearing voices telling him he was worthless. He'd have conversations with people who weren't there. He'd stay awake for days at a time because he was afraid to sleep. It was terrifying to watch my son struggling like that, and I knew he needed professional help. But every time I brought up therapy or medication to Vincent, he'd shut it down. He'd say Landon was just looking for attention or trying to manipulate us into feeling sorry for him. Vincent would point to times when Landon's episodes seemed to happen right when I'd ask him to do chores, or when Vincent would bring up him finding a job. "Convenient timing," Vincent would mutter. I started to resent Vincent's lack of empathy. Here was my son, clearly suffering from some kind of mental health crisis, and my husband's response was suspicion and irritation. What kind of man sees someone in pain and assumes they're faking it? What kind of stepfather refuses to even consider that his stepson might need help? The final straw came on a Tuesday morning about 8 months after Landon moved in. I came downstairs to find some leftover takeout containers on the kitchen counter and a few crumbs on the floor. Honestly, it wasn't even that big of a mess, just the kind of thing that happens when someone eats late at night. But Vincent saw it and absolutely exploded. He stormed over to Landon's room and started pounding on the door, yelling about respect and responsibility. Landon, who'd probably been up all night because of his anxiety, yelled back through the door that he'd clean it up later. That's when Vincent completely lost his shit. He was screaming about how this was his house and his rules, and if Landon couldn't follow basic common courtesy, then maybe he needed to find somewhere else to live. I tried to calm Vincent down, pointing out that it was just some food containers and we could clean it up together. But Vincent whipped around and started yelling at me too, saying this was all my fault for enabling Landon's behavior. Enabling? I was trying to help my son through a mental health crisis, and Vincent was acting like Landon had personally attacked him. So I told Vincent he was being completely unreasonable and that Landon was dealing with real issues that required patience and understanding, not screaming matches over dirty dishes. That's when Vincent gave me the ultimatum that would end our marriage. "Either he goes, or we're getting divorced," Vincent said, his voice cold and final. "I'm not gonna live like this anymore. Choose." I stared at him, honestly shocked that he would make me choose between him and my son. What kind of husband puts his wife in that position? What kind of man threatens divorce over helping a family member who's struggling? "If you're going to make me choose," I said, "then I choose Landon. He's my son, and he needs me." Vincent just nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "Fine, then you both need to be out of my house by the end of the month. I'm filing for divorce." Just like that. 3 years of marriage and he was ready to throw it all away because he couldn't handle some family drama. No discussion about compromise, no suggestion of counseling or finding ways to work through it. Just an ultimatum, and then immediate rejection when I didn't choose the way he wanted. I told Vincent he was making a huge mistake, that he was destroying our marriage over his inability to show compassion for someone who was clearly struggling. But Vincent had already checked out mentally. He said Landon would never get better, that I'd be taking care of him for the rest of my life, and that he wasn't signing up for that kind of responsibility. The thing that really got to me was how selfish Vincent was being. He'd gotten to live his whole adult life without the complications of children. He'd had his career, his freedom, his comfortable retirement, and now when life presented a real challenge that required sacrifice and patience, he just bailed. He wanted all the benefits of having a family, the companionship, the home-cooked meals, the partnership, without any of the messy, complicated parts that come with loving people. After Vincent dropped his divorce bomb, I spent the next few weeks trying to figure out what Landon and I were going to do. The reality of our situation hit me pretty quickly. Vincent had been covering most of our major expenses: mortgage, utilities, insurance. My income from working at the medical office was decent, but it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle we'd been living. I started looking at apartments we could afford, and let me tell you, it was a wake-up call. Everything in our price range was either too small, in a bad neighborhood, or required a security deposit I didn't have. Meanwhile, Vincent was acting like we were just roommates whose lease was up. He'd come home from wherever he was spending his days, grab something from the fridge, and disappear into his room without saying a word to either of us. Landon was taking the whole situation really hard. He kept apologizing and saying it was all his fault, that I should stay with Vincent and he'd figure something else out. But where was he going to go? His dad had made it clear he wasn't welcome back. He had no money, and his mental health issues made it nearly impossible for him to function independently. I told Landon that family doesn't abandon family, and that Vincent's reaction just proved he was never really committed to being part of our family anyway. A real husband would have found a way to make it work. A real man would have supported his wife through difficult family situations, instead of issuing ultimatums. The divorce proceedings moved quickly since we had a prenup. Vincent's lawyer was pushing for a clean break. No alimony, no ongoing support, just split up the few assets we'd accumulated together and call it done. Fine by me. I didn't want to be financially tied to someone who'd shown such a lack of character when things got tough. We found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town and moved out right on schedule. It was a huge adjustment. Cramped space, thin walls, neighbors who played music too loud. But I figured it was temporary. Once Landon got stable on medication and found steady work, we could upgrade to something better. Except, that's not how it worked out. If anything, the stress of our new living situation made Landon's episodes worse. He'd have panic attacks about the noise from upstairs, or he'd become convinced that the neighbors were talking about him through the walls. The few job interviews he managed to get didn't go well because his anxiety was so obvious. I started working extra hours to make ends meet, which meant Landon was home alone more often. Sometimes I'd come back to find him having conversations with voices only he could hear, or he'd be awake for the 3rd night in a row because he was afraid to sleep. It was heartbreaking and exhausting, and I couldn't help but think about how much easier things would have been if Vincent had just shown a little compassion. About 6 months after the divorce was final, I ran into Carmen at the grocery store. Vincent's ex-wife had always been polite, but distant during our marriage, so I was surprised when she approached me in the produce section. "How are you holding up?" she asked, and something in her tone made me think she genuinely wanted to know. I ended up telling her about our situation, the apartment, Landon's ongoing struggles, how tight money was. Carmen listened without judgment, nodding in all the right places. Then she said something that stopped me cold. "I tried to tell Vincent he was getting in over his head," she said. "When he told me about Landon's issues, I warned him that single mothers with dependent adult children are a complicated situation. But he was so sure he could handle it. Vincent had been talking to his ex-wife about our problems?" about Landon's mental health issues. The betrayal hit me like a slap. All those times I tried to get Vincent to understand what we were dealing with, and he'd been discussing it with Carmen like we were some kind of problem to be solved. But Carmen wasn't done. He called me after you moved out, she continued. He was pretty torn up about it, actually. Said he felt guilty but that he couldn't watch you sacrifice your whole future for someone who might never get better. Guilty? Vincent felt guilty? The same man who'd given me an ultimatum and kicked us out of his house? The same man who'd shown zero empathy for his stepson's struggles? Then Carmen dropped the real bomb. He's seeing someone new now, she said. Almost casually. Linda something. Nice woman, divorced, but her kids are all grown and doing well. They seem really happy together. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Carmen had said. Vincent was dating again, and he'd found someone whose family complications were already resolved. How convenient for him. He got to skip all the messy, difficult parts of helping someone through a crisis and jump straight to the comfortable, easy parts of a relationship. I found myself driving past his house a few days later. Okay, maybe I'd done it more than once over the past year, just curious about what he was up to. This time, I saw them together in the front yard. Vincent was helping a blonde woman plant flowers in the garden bed we'd talked about putting in, but never got around to. They were laughing about something, and Vincent looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in the last year of our marriage. It hit me then that Vincent wasn't inherently incapable of happiness or partnership. He just wasn't willing to deal with the complications that came with my situation. He'd found someone whose baggage was manageable, whose adult children were self-sufficient, whose life didn't require the kind of sacrifice and patience that loving Landon demanded. Meanwhile, here I was, almost 2 years post-divorce, and things weren't getting better. Landon's condition hadn't improved despite trying different medications and therapists. If anything, the financial stress of supporting both of us on my salary was making everything worse. I was working 50-hour weeks and still barely making ends meet. Landon couldn't hold down even part-time work because of his episodes, so our entire household income depended on me. The apartment was too small for both of us, especially when Landon was having bad days and needed space to work through his anxiety. I'd given up my bedroom twice in the past month because Landon was convinced someone was watching him through his window, and he needed to sleep somewhere that felt safer. I started going to a support group for parents of adult children with mental health issues. Hearing other people's stories was supposed to make me feel less alone, but honestly, it just highlighted how unusual Vincent's reaction had been. Most of the other parents talked about spouses who'd stepped up and become part of the solution. They'd mention husbands who'd gone to therapy appointments with their stepchildren, or wives who'd researched treatment options and helped create structured environments for recovery. Vincent had done none of that. At the first sign of real difficulty, he'd bailed. He'd protected his comfortable retirement and his peaceful house by removing the complications from his life. Must be nice to have that luxury. Last month, I got a letter from Vincent's lawyer about some final paperwork that needed to be signed. Along with the legal documents was a note from Vincent himself. He wrote that he hoped Landon was doing better and that I was finding happiness. He said he didn't regret our marriage, but that he'd realized he wasn't equipped to handle the challenges that came with our family situation. The note felt like salt in a wound I'd thought was healing. Vincent was essentially saying that loving me hadn't been worth the difficulty of dealing with Landon. That his comfort and peace of mind were more important than supporting his wife through a family crisis. But the worst part was the last line. I hope you understand that some situations don't have solutions that work for everyone. Like our marriage failing was just some inevitable outcome rather than the result of his choices. Like his decision to abandon us was just a natural consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control. I crumpled up the note and threw it away, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd written. Because the truth is, Vincent was right about one thing. I probably will be taking care of Landon for the rest of my life. His condition isn't improving, and at 32 now, it's becoming clear that he may never be able to live independently. That means I'll be working until I physically can't anymore. It means I'll never have the retirement I'd planned, never have the freedom to travel or pursue hobbies or just enjoy my golden years. It means my entire future is tied to managing someone else's mental health crisis and making sure he has a roof over his head and food in his stomach. Vincent got to walk away from all of that and start fresh with someone whose complications were already resolved. He got to keep his comfortable house, his stable retirement, his peaceful daily routine. He found a partner who enhanced his life instead of complicating it. Sometimes, late at night when Landon is having an episode and I'm trying to calm him down while calculating whether we have enough money for groceries this week, I wonder if Vincent was the smart one. Maybe he understood something about self-preservation that I never learned. Maybe there's wisdom in recognizing your limitations and protecting your own well-being. But then I look at Landon, my son, who's struggling with things beyond his control, and I know I made the only choice I could live with. Vincent might be happy with his new girlfriend and his uncomplicated life, but he's also someone who abandons people when they need him most. He's someone who chooses comfort over commitment, convenience over compassion. I don't regret choosing Landon over Vincent, but I do regret believing that Vincent was the kind of man who would choose us too.